No, we would generally prefer the first length in a tree, but obviously when a tree like that where you've got subsequent lengths, one has the opportunity of matching all those lengths in object, so it gives more options. But also the larger the size, clearly that also gives us more choice in terms of how it might be sawn.
One interesting development, I mean, most of this material will be sold not actually to a sawmill. There's a sort of another category of buyers that have appeared in the last 15 years, who are people who buy the material standing or at roadside like this. Generally they buy it at roadside when we've cut it down. They will saw it in a sawmill on contract, and then their job, they will sometimes then, they basically will be selling it on, sometimes doing some further processing. And one of the major ash suppliers into the furniture industry and into the sports ash industry is one of these people. There's a key person in the beach industry that does this now. They are much more, well, they seem to be more entrepreneurial in terms of their marketing than the bigger mills. And I probably ought to give you the name of the person who I deal with. But I think they have actually, they are, and I've tended to move towards supplying people like that rather than actually the big mills anymore. And because they are able to add value a bit more, but they also tend to have more consistent demands because actually they are connected directly with relatively small real end users like yourself, and they are connected into the furniture trade and tend to have a more consistent demand because they've built up a wider range of markets. The big sawmills tend to be, they always want oak, but they'll want a bit of ash this year, and then 6 months later you ring them up, oh, we don't want any. So particularly for ash, but it's the same with beech as well. There's, as I say, there's this other class of.
What do they call themselves? Would you call them brokers, or are they something different from that?
I don't know what we call them. I mean, they are. I suppose they're sawn timber merchants rather than sawmillers. The management of the forest is very much easier if, as I say, the forest manager has some direct interaction with it. Because over the year, the only way you really know about the forest is if you go in there and you mark a thinning. And when I was trained, we weren't really trained, it wasn't really anticipated that the management would get involved with marking trees. One good thing about this approach, and another whole aspect to it, is to try and increase over an equivalent period to a even age rotation, so let's say 50 years in conifers, 120 in broadleaves, to try and end up over that whole period with a larger average tree produced, because harvesting, marking costs, my costs are related to the size of the tree. The bigger the tree is, the cheaper everything is. So if you can achieve over the whole system a higher average sized tree, then you reduce your harvesting costs. It doesn't take very long for me to mark trees. You know, the cost per cubic metre or hopper's foot is low with a big tree. It's actually very expensive if you're in this sort of stand. So that's another key idea, is to try and increase the average size of the tree you produce. This has arisen through management and by natural regeneration, but we've ended up with a relatively even-aged stand. There's no trees above. We've actually had quite successful natural regeneration. We haven't spent any money on planting here at all. But if we look at the trees, this is an issue for John and for all the hardwood growers, is that even though this is quite a good genetic strain of ash, so fundamentally it has, most trees want to produce a relatively straight tree. But you can see that either by genetically or by something that happened early on in the stand, we can see quite a variety of individuals here. This one has got a fairly major fork at 7 or 8 feet. This one has got a kink. Again, what's happened is the leading shoot's been killed by something, by frost or possibly by a moth, and it's made it go out to level 2. Some tend to have slightly less straight, persistent leaders, that one for example. Now this may be genetic, it may be just because of side competition, because these have risen closer together. Let's have a look at the tree that the long-term objective is, like everywhere else, is this to eventually in 150 years time to be a regular. But at the moment, we've got to manage it as it is. So I would still be looking for the trees that I would want to work with, say in 50, 60, not me, somebody else, in 60 or 70 years' time. And I mean, we can pick out from here a few that are potentially trees that are that might produce the sort of trees we've just seen over there. Now this one here, that one. Every thinning, we would always remove bacterial, the cankered trees. And it reduces the amount of inoculum in the general environment.
Right. And burn, or is it not?
No, we don't have to worry about that. Well, it generally disappears because of firewood, so it all goes, apart from the top. But no, we don't have a big problem. If you look at the crown of these, they're very, very small now. And it's very clear that the difference between that one, which has got quite a big crown, and this one, which is very small. That's the reason, of course, why that one is that much thicker than this little one. So the issue really here is, at the moment, there's lots of resources up there, lots of sun and energy, and there's moisture here, there's nutrients. At the moment, they're all being applied to all of these individuals, and quite a lot of these individuals, are not going to produce long lengths of green timber. We've got some. Also you've got there's a sycamore. There's sycamore in amongst this as well. Problems with squirrel damage and this. And you've also got a tree there that's been subject to bark stripping by deer, that one. So that will never produce a high quality tree. So at a basic level, the forester's job is to make sure that more resources end up going to your best trees and not wasted on small trees. And whatever system we use, that's a sort of basic point. So then the issue is, well, how quickly do we do it? The sooner we can do it, the quicker that one will grow. To a certain extent, in some circumstances, you can find a good tree which is completely dominated by a poor tree, in which case, obviously, it may be a bit more urgent to do something. There's an economic issue as to how quickly you have to do it. In my situation, I would prefer not to do it until I can sell at a profit the trees I'm removing. And here we come back to the harvesting issue. This stand here, we could not make a profit by removing the trees of this size. So trees of, if we wanted to remove this one, say that one beside that one to favour this one, at the moment it would make a loss. You're aware, particularly with regard to hardwood, that there's a massive price differential between the good and the bad. In conifers it's not quite so extreme, but certainly in hardwoods, the value of a low quality oak tree can be 20-30 times less than the value of a good one. So the question is, how do we cost effectively try and fill the stands with the higher quality trees? It's that cost effectiveness, and find a way in which we can sustainably do it. And that means really in terms of having a low risk approach, which doesn't require, which is less at risk of sporadic bad management, because the problem with plantation forestry is that every so often you will get, over a life of a stand, you will get some periods when the management is not quite so good as it in other times. That's what we've seen in this country very much. I think that we've ended up with a growing stock of trees which has got a relatively low number of high quality trees, and the whole conundrum has been, how do we turn it round in a way which we can actually afford to do sensibly and on quite a big scale. The best way of thinking about it is to think of it being an alternative to treating the forest as a set of agricultural fields. So the standard approach is to make a forest, no matter how heterogeneous it is, and to conceive of it as being a grouping of fields. Each field grows it. You grow the crop, you fell it, and you replant it almost independently of everything else. What that means is that you lose the concept of managing the whole forest on a permanent basis, and it also requires a lot more input particularly at key phases, the regeneration phase, and also in stages like this, where you end up with a lot of small trees which you have to then manipulate into a stand with only a few large trees. And the alternative is to effectively go back to not necessarily create a natural structure, but to use more natural processes to keep the forest intact and to make it do what you want it to do, rather than by using the forest ecosystem rather than applying an agricultural model to it. So you end up with a more natural situation in where you get a mixture of tree sizes, and where regeneration occurs sporadically through the stand rather than being concentrated in certain areas following a large-scale clear fell.